Word of prayer. Father, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So we've talked previously about Ezra and Nehemiah, books set in the Achaemenid or Persian Empire. This is the third of the biblical books that occupy that same setting, not counting Daniel, which is also in that same kind of context. But it's the third in this cluster of books that we call the writings. Esther is different from Ezra and Nehemiah in the sense that Ezra and Nehemiah presents itself as a historical account interlarded with documents culled from the royal archives and other sources to try to flesh out exactly what happened when the Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem, rebuild the altar, rebuild the temple, and rebuild the city walls. Esther, in contrast, is not an account of those historical events. It's more like a drama or a story that happens to be set in the same environment. And so part of what I would like to do today is to give you a taste of that environment, just so that your imaginations are sparked in the right way when you read this story. And part of what I would like to do is to show you how Esther works as a story. How is it constructed dramatically to deliver the messages that it aims to deliver? What we're looking at here, by the way, are archaeological reconstructions of the palace of Darius the Great. This large square structure, which is on the right here, that site, along with the site of Persepolis. Susa and Persepolis were the two great capitals of the Persian Empire, Persepolis being the main one, Susa being the sort of winter retreat. And Susa, and this building complex, is where Esther takes place. Excuse me. There we go. Pardon me for a moment. My remote is not treating me well. This is the outside of that big square building that I was talking about. Just to give you a feel for the scale, if you're at ground level, the doors that you can see at the bottom left and in the midst of the arcade there, the peristyle, are large doors. So this is a huge building. We can see, actually, that these capitals are like this because this is one of them, and it's in the Louvre Museum. A lot of pieces of this temple, palace compound, are in the Louvre, and so I will show you a few of them just to give you a sense of what it's like. Here's what the walls would have looked like. In Esther 1, we find that the king is holding a festival, a 6-month festival followed by a 7-day feast. And the text points out that part of the purpose of this is to show the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness. It says that there were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars. And there were also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Honestly, the furnishings and trappings were so glorious that whoever wrote this did not even have time to look at the fact that the walls are covered with amazing mosaics of hunters with their spears and their bows, with the prey, which in this particular case include not just lions, but also mythological beasts like griffins. These are not replicas. These are the real things from the real palace. The empire, as I pointed out last time when we looked at Nehemiah, sprawled all the way from India to Western Turkey, and Darius had made a play for Greece as well. His son, whom we call Xerxes I, was also very interested in that, and the Persian wars with Greece were one of his major preoccupations. So for orientation, of course, here's Italy, here's Greece,
Here's Turkey. Here's Israel. This is Mesopotamia between the rivers, and Susa is pretty close to Mesopotamia right there, not too far from Babylon. And I will show you again the timeline. I should point out that the king in the story of Esther is called Ahasuerus, which is Hebrew for something. And there is some discussion as to who exactly it is. It's clearly a translation of Xerxes at its base. But the problem is that there are three Xerxeses. Xerxai? Xerxopodes? I don't know. Here's a Xerxes, that's the big one. There's also Artaxerxes the first. There's also Artaxerxes the second. Most of what you will come across if you read commentaries on Esther is that we're talking about Xerxes the first. That's the consensus view. But in the ancient world, a lot of authorities, including some pretty notable ones, thought it was Artaxerxes the first. So the truth is, we're not exactly sure which kingdom this maps onto, but the text is filled with all sorts of courtly detail and intrigue, including the names of key players, details about how the government was organized, obviously descriptions of the palace and the culture, all of which help to demonstrate that it is unquestionably a text from that era and context. So we're going to go with Xerxes the first. That's probably right. What I want you to understand is that in a court that is the court of the wealthiest empire that has ever existed, that is spending lavishly not only on maintaining its empire, but also on asserting the authority of the king by wrapping him in splendor, that the kind of literature and literary culture that that sort of environment produces tends to write sophisticated texts. And this is a sophisticated, textually rich story. There are all sorts of patterns in it that I won't be talking about today, but that are very interesting. I've simply chosen the couple of patterns that I think are most enriching for our purposes that give you a feel for the overall structure of the book. Now we know that Hebrew texts, Hebrew literature is often chiastic, as much ancient literature is. Chiastic simply means that it throws a few items on a stack and then it removes them in reverse order, usually with something pretty important happening in the middle of that. And Esther is no different. Here's the structure of the story overall. First, King Ahasuerus, I'll just call him the king, holds a long feast for the empire. This is 6 months of people from the 120 plus provinces of his sprawling empire coming to Susa to celebrate the glory of his inauguration as king and the early years of his engagements in military victory. So he holds a long feast for the empire, and then he holds a short feast of 7 days for Susa. That pattern of doing something empire-wide and then doing something local is going to continue to be important throughout the tale. So he holds a long feast, he holds a short feast. At the short feast, he asks his gorgeous wife to come out and present herself before his guests so that they can appreciate not just what cool mosaic walls he has and nice linen hangings, but that his main squeeze is incredibly beautiful. That's the point of the demonstration. And he's even given her a feast to hold on the side with her courtly women. She disobeys. She says, I'm not coming when you call, I'm busy. Call me some other time, I'm not doing this. And that is in front of all of the leaders of the provinces who are present. It's an embarrassment. And he flies into a rage because that's not how he had imagined things playing out. In typical patriarchal terms, he consults with his advisors about what the law states he ought to do in this circumstance, and that law states that she should be banished forever from his presence. And so he repels Vashti. He says, you are no longer welcome in the presence of the king. You're not my queen anymore. This is ironic for a couple of reasons, and it sets the tone of the book, which is a little bit a tone of light humor. The humor here is that she disobeys him by refusing to come into his presence, and the punishment, after much consultation with learned men, is that she's no longer allowed in his presence, which is precisely the thing she wanted anyway. So there's a little bit of a laugh line there. But the point is that the first 4 beats of the story are long feast, short feast. She disobeys him by not coming when called, and then he repels her. He goes off to war for 2 or 3 years and then comes back, and he's kind of missing her, but he knows that, as Daniel mentions twice, and this text also emphasizes, a kingly edict by a Persian emperor cannot be revoked. It's a one-way law system that they have in the Persian Empire. So he knows he's not getting Vashti back, and he goes to his advisors and says, what should I do about this? Yes, I have a harem, but I want someone special. They propose to him in the story that he gather young women from all through the Susa, from all around the area, give them a year to put on their makeup. Maybe that's also a laugh line, I'm not sure. Courtly protocol specified 6 months for perfume and 6 months for cosmetics. It's actually in the text. And he thinks this is a great idea. You know, it's kind of like a fairy tale, right? So Esther is among the people swept up in this recruitment of young women who might become candidates for queenship. She doesn't reveal she's a Jew because her adoptive father, who is actually her cousin but of an older generation, tells her, don't let him know you're a Jew. Just, don't mention that in casual conversation. And she doesn't. She's gorgeous, she's smart, she's clever, and her cleverness shows in the text in this way. While everyone else is indulging in their Sephora fest for the whole year, she does the minimum. She talks to the chief eunuch and says, what do you think I should do? And the women are allowed to come before the king bringing whatever they want from the harem, but he advises her, go simple, and she says, I'll just take me and whatever you think I should bring. She's very deferential, and therefore she wins the admiration of the chief eunuch over the harem, who's an important person and probably has the king's ear about which of these women are tolerable and which aren't. And when she finally goes before the king, she attracts him. She attracts him not only because of her beauty, but because she's also different from the usual fare. She's humble. She's, in fact, obedient. And what is the problem with the wife he evicted? She was disobedient. So we have to remember that Esther's number one apparent virtue is subservience and willingness to follow the rules and go along and do what the people who are better advised than she is think she should do. She's obedient. Which is why it's very ironic that the chiasm of the story unfolds with this series of unexpected occurrences, starting with Esther disobeys. Esther disobeys. While Vashti disobeyed by not coming when called, Esther is going to disobey by coming when not called, which was also against the law. You can't bust into the throne room and demand an audience with the king if he hasn't summoned you by name. You're putting your life on the line, and you will be killed unless, in an act of mercy toward you, he points his golden scepter at you and gives you an instant pardon. All right, so everything unwinds from the chiasm. King repels Vashti. Esther attracts the king. Esther disobeys by coming when not called. Esther holds a short feast for the king and Haman. Esther establishes a perpetual feast for the Jews. So long feast, short feast, short feast. Disobeying, disobeying, repelling, attracting. And the key question underlying this structure is, how did 3' happen? How did Esther disobey when she's this, ideal, obedient woman? Well, it turns out that that's where most of the book of Esther takes place, and it's all there to explain how that happens. The remainder of the book, almost all of it, squeezes in between 4' and 3' and explains what happened between the time when Esther the obedient attracted the king's attention and became queen and the point where she disobeyed him, and why. So what I would like to do is show you the structure of that part that is squeezed in, because it has its own literary structure, and it's not chiastic, it's repetitive. There are lots of repetitions throughout this story, kind of the way there are in Hebrew poetry, where one verse of Hebrew poetry will consist of a statement and then a restatement in slightly different words. This book is filled with that kind of thing. And it's not just at the level of sentences that people utter, although that's true, but it's also at the level of structure. So here is what happens in the gap. We'll mind the gap. The very next thing that happens after Esther is celebrated as queen is that we cut to Mordecai, her stepfather / uncle, advisor. He has her back. He shows up, at the perimeter of the court and hangs out outside the gates, trying to hear gossip from the court about what's going on with Esther. And he does it pretty regularly. And at one point when he's there, he hears a couple of eunuchs grumbling. Eunuchs are the castrated servants of the king, mostly people in charge of the harems, but they have a lot of official duties and were often also, on some level, courtly advisors. He hears a couple of them conspiring against the king. And he doesn't see this opportunistically. He sees it simply in shock that people would do such an evil thing, and he reports it. He says, excuse me, Mr. King, if you wouldn't mind. He seeks an audience. He tells someone who passes the word on to the king that there's a plot against him. They investigate it, says the text. They find out it's true, and they hang those two eunuchs. So Mordecai saves the life of the king because of the fact that his interest in Esther puts him in the right place at the right time to overhear sloppy gossip and spillage of secrets that lead him to uncover a conspiracy. So then the text after it gives us that little tidbit. It goes into the story of Haman, or Haman as we call, or Haman, however you want to say. I'll say Haman. I think that's a common pronunciation. There are 4 beats to the Haman cycle. When Haman does something, it usually follows this pattern. Newly promoted, he's elevated by the king to a lofty position in the court. Newly promoted, he dresses himself up in all of his pompous gear and then goes strutting through town, expecting people to honor and revere him, to bow down to him, to admire him for his newfound glory as an elevated person who has the ear of the king, an important courtier. And in doing that, passes by all the people at the gate, one of whom is Mordecai, and Mordecai conspicuously declines to bow down to him. Mordecai refuses to bow down. And this throws him into a rage. How dare you? This is a legal edict. You're supposed to do this. I deserve it. Can't you see that? Do you not understand these robes and a pomp and everything? So in a rage, Haman decides then and there, I'm going to get back at this person a billionfold, because I'm going to destroy not just him, but everyone like him. His purported reason for not bowing to me is his religion, that he's forbidden to do so somehow by his religion. And that means that anyone, this is Haman logic, anyone who is of the same religion will also refuse to bow down to me. And I represent the king, so that really they're declining to bow down to the king. That tastes like insurrection or rebellion or lack of compliance with the absolute law. I'm going to have all these people killed. And in having all of them killed, I will also happen to take out the one who insulted me personally. Yes?
Can we take the question?
Yes, sure.
I never thought about it before,
Mm-hmm.
but Mordecai has told Esther not to reveal her ethnicity.
Mm-hmm.
I never thought why Haman knew Mordecai's ethnicity. I don't remember anything in the text.
The text says that, yes, it is explained. It's a good question. The question, for those who didn't hear, is if Mordecai told Esther not to reveal her ethnicity as she went into the heart of the court, then how is it that Haman, walking among the people expecting to be revered, knows that he's a Jew? And the answer that the text gives is that everyone around was shocked and murmuring and said, "Why are you doing this?" And he said, "I'm a Jew." So, I mean, the text makes it explicit that it was a point of some discussion when this occurs. I will glance briefly to see if I can find a good verse. He did not bow down or pay homage to him, so Haman was filled with fury, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So, as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews. The people of Mordecai throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, so that as they had made known to him who the people of Mordecai were. So who is the they, right? The they is all the other people. We have to imagine a scenario where everyone else who is bowing down is saying, dude, bow down. And he won't do it. And they say, why aren't you bowing down? And he says, well, here's why. And the reason that that's a legitimate thing to do is that this whole episode repeats. All of this has happened before and will happen again. And the second time, they make explicit that there's chatter about it. So from the people with, and Mordecai isn't in the court. He's not trying to protect himself. He just wants to protect Esther and saying, you're in the belly of the beast. Don't be too conspicuous, right? And especially now that she's queen, you don't want to spoil a good thing. Assuming it would spoil it, which as it turns out, it wouldn't. But we don't know that at this point. So the 4 beats of the Haman cycle are, he goes out expecting to be revered. Mordecai refuses to bow down. He plots the death of all Jews using lots. And then he issues an edict and schmoozes with the king. Those 4 things happen over the course of a year. And the way it breaks down is this. This is at the level of the entire empire. He goes out and Mordecai refuses to bow down. And the plotting of the death of the Jews takes a whole year because it's the month of Nisan. And on sometime in the 2nd week of Nisan, which is in the spring, that's when Haman decides he's going to do this. But because of the fact that there are ways of doing such things, he consults court astrologers, those who know how to cast lots, to find out when he should schedule this mass genocide. And they roll dice, and they say, is it this month? Oh, no, it's not this month. Next month? No, that's not auspicious. Which month is it? It turns out that they get to the final month of the cycle, Adar, 12 months out, 11 months out. And then they cast lots for the day and so forth. A lot in the languages of Pur and Purim is the plural of like dice, and Purim is the holiday that this whole book is about. It has to do with this casting of lots, because what Haman believes is that he doesn't see himself as doing this because he's hacked off because he's arrogant and someone didn't respect his authority, right? It's not just that. It's that he represents the king, so they're disrespecting, these foreigners among us are disrespecting our ways, and we're going to follow our conventions for figuring out how to kill them all. And that involves deciding to do it in the month of Nisan and scheduling it for the end of the year, because that's what the soothsayers have decreed should happen. That gives them time to plan it, to get logistical, issues worked out, like being sure people are in place in all the cities throughout the whole empire, from India to Turkey. Do you have Jews? Line them up, put yellow stars on them. Let's be sure we are in position to kill them all. That's the reason that a year seems like an appropriate amount of time, instead of him just going, you can't just go out and kill hundreds of thousands of people. It's a management problem. All right. The reason I call this a cycle is because as soon as it finishes in the text, it's a few other things happen, and then the cycle starts again. Haman goes out expecting honor and reverence a second time. Mordecai again refuses to bow down a second time. Haman goes home and says to his family, it's kind of sad and hilarious. Haman restrains himself, doesn't kill Mordecai on the spot. He goes home, brings his friends and his wife Zeresh, and Haman recounts to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions with which the king has honored him, and how he has advanced him above all other officials and servants of the king. And then Haman said, even Queen Esther, let no one but me come with the king to the feast that she prepared, and blah, blah, blah. We'll get to that in a moment. Tomorrow I'm also dining with the king. I'm so important. I'm an insider. I'm in the room where it happens. Yet all of this is worth nothing to me so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. So again, as before, he's hacked off, but now it's Mordecai individually, right? So if this is at the scope of the entire empire, this is at the scope of what's happening in Susa at the gates of the palace we saw in those pictures. And what's happening there is he goes out, Mordecai refuses, And so Haman decides, at the prompting of his family, to build a gallows that very day on his own land, 70 feet high. This is a pole, and they're either going to hang Mordecai from it or impale him on it. Experts differ, but either way, it's not a good scene. So retribution against all Jews, retribution against this Jew by hanging or impaling. And if we understand how literature works, we know that when a literary work establishes a pattern and then mostly repeats that pattern, it's to set up anticipation where we guess what comes next based on the pattern that we've seen. And if we were to do that, as Haman was doing it, then we would expect him, after coming up with the plan for hanging or impaling tomorrow, Haman issues the edict to hang Mordecai high on his lawn tomorrow, and then schmoozes with the king some more. That's what ought to go in these blanks, right? But then that's where the story pulls the rug out from under us. And the reason that the rug is pulled out from under us is that things happen that are out of Haman's control. There's a pattern, but there are also surprises in God's providence. For example, Mordecai tells Esther, by way of a messenger, but then in person, about the edict. Haman didn't know that it would get to Esther, but he also didn't care because he doesn't know Esther has a dog in this fight, right? He doesn't know she's a Jew and will care about this. This happens under the radar, and it's a big deal because what Mordecai says is everyone all your people throughout the empire are going to die, including me, including you, by this edict. What are you going to do about it? Because you have the king's ear and he really, really likes you. And she says, if I go before the king when I haven't been invited, I'm at risk of being killed. And he says, you're at risk of being killed anyway. It's just a question of now or 11 months from now, right? So she says, look, here's what I think we should do. I have a plan. Let's have 3 days of prayer and fasting. I'll do it. You do it. Tell all the Jews of Susa to do it. Tell Jews as far as you can reach Jews to spend these 3 days fasting and praying that God will deliver us from this horrible, irrevocable condemnation somehow. And then I will take action. And the action she's going to take consists of the following. She's going to go into the throne room when she's not supposed to be there, risking her life, and counting on the king's mercy and magnanimity to point the scepter at her so that she won't be killed. And if that happens, if she lives through that ordeal, she will invite the king and Haman to a little feast, a banquet that she prepares. She's going to throw a party for them. Because what he says to her when he acknowledges her is, anything you wish for up to half my kingdom, I grant you. It's a formula. Any wife who really asked for half the kingdom, would be hit with some sort of alimony suit. It would not have played out like that. But she doesn't ask for half the kingdom. She asks, come to my meal. And so she holds a meal. And it's lavish, and it's beautiful, and it's splendid, and she doesn't show her hand. And at that meal, he's so pleased that he says his formula a second time. He says, this lamb was great. Ask me for anything and you can have it, whatever you want. And at the second meal, she's going to reveal who she is and what's going on. But right now, we're just talking about the first meal. And it's right after that first meal when he's filled with delicious lamb and yummy veggies and spectacular strong drink that he goes out expecting honor and reverence, and Mordecai refuses to bow down. And so because he's feeling especially honored by the king, it's then that he feels especially offended that people won't honor him. Here's another thing that he does not anticipate, Haman. He does not anticipate that on the same day that he's at home whining to his family about how he's not getting the proper amount of respect from this guy, the king has insomnia. And since he really has no sheep to count in a palace like this, he says, bring me the most boring book that you have. Let's just read it to me until I fall asleep. And the most boring book he has is the chronicle of his own courtly activities, which happens to have the virtue also of reminding him whether he's let any spinning plates drop or dropped the ball somewhere. And they get to the point where Mordecai saves his life, and he says, wait a minute, wind that back and say that again. He saved what was done for this guy? He saved my life. He uncovered a conspiracy. We executed the perpetrators. Was he honored properly? And they say, there's no, maybe not. We don't see any evidence that he was ever honored. And so the king says, I'm gonna go to sleep now and think on it, but I feel like maybe this is why I couldn't sleep. I have unfinished business. And the next day, Haman comes in expecting to issue his edict to kill Mordecai, have Mordecai hanged. And instead, the king says, what would you do for the person who had done something wonderful for the king? And Haman thinks, oh, he's talking about me, isn't he? I would put that person on the king's best horse and dress him up in lavish clothing and parade him around the city and require everyone to revere him for his wonderfulness. And Haman says, and the king says, great, go find Mordecai and do that for him because he saved my life once. And this is obviously crushing. This is a lot like the passage where Nathan comes to David after the incident with Bathsheba and says, what would you do to someone who stole a poor guy's lamb and took it for his own? Oh, that man should be condemned. Well, it's you, David, because you stole Bathsheba from the Hittite. It's very similar to that. And at this juncture, Haman he realizes that he does not, in fact, have control of the cycle, that other stuff is going on. So how does everything play out in E blank and E blank? What happens? Well, instead, the king makes Haman honor Mordecai, and Esther at the second meal says, you ask me, king, what is my next wish or my next request? My wish is that you let me live, and my request is that you let my people live, because this guy right here has sent out an irrevocable edict in your name that we should all be slaughtered. And the king is obviously outraged by this and walks out of the room to let his mind buzz on this fact, while Haman pleads for his life to the person whose people he was previously ready to condemn. Now he's asking to be spared because he sees the writing on the wall. He also knows that he was going after Mordecai and that there's evidence of it. There's a big 70-foot pole in his front yard, and he's got the rough draft of the edict ready for the king's signet ring. His fingerprints are all over the attempt to kill the guy that the king just chose to honor and that he just participated. He looks bad, is what I'm saying. And sure enough, the king takes him and kills him and hangs Haman on the pole that he had intended for Mordecai. He gives all of Haman's property to Esther. Esther designates Mordecai as the major domo, the man in charge of it all. And they start thinking, how are we going to reverse this? Because there's a problem still, and that problem is that you can't roll back the king's edict. So what they're going to do is come up with a counter edict that says, yeah, still let everyone try to kill the Jews in that month, but guess what? We're also going to tell all the Jews to arm themselves and get ready, and Jews are allowed to counterattack and kill anyone who tries to take them out. And we will supply all of the ammo. And so now everyone who was thinking about attacking Jews coming up, well, they're all seeing a very publicized edict saying that if they try it, they're going to be counter-slaughtered. They will be slaughtered instead. Some try. About 800 people in Susa are killed by the Jews for trying to kill Susan Jews, and a large number from throughout the empire as well are killed in their attempt to eradicate the Jews. But the Jews are at least forewarned, prepared, and armed by the king to defuse the problem. This solves it in a number of ways. The king's edict still stands. He didn't have to revoke his irrevocable edict. His law stood, and his law justly condemned, or unjustly condemned, a certain people. But then he had more to say. He has now an additional provision that provides salvation for those same people, so that justice and mercy are both satisfied. That's the cleverness of Esther's plot. She and Mordecai came up with that. Mordecai issues the edict using the king's seal that tells all the Jews to be prepared and gives them the means to defend themselves. This should sound a little bit familiar, and I think I want to end with this. The book of Esther never says God. It never mentions God. The only thing it does is talk about courtly life. But God is throughout it, because God is the one who introduces the surprises and the coincidences and the deviations from the pattern that make a provision for his people. The first response of Esther to finding out that everyone was going to be in jeopardy was to fast and pray. Do you think that was to one of the lions in the hallway? No, it's to God, right? Her first reaction is to pray to God. You don't say it, but that's what's happening. Mordecai wouldn't bow down. Why? Because he didn't want to revere anyone above God. In the end, the fact that the king had insomnia, what a coincidence that he has insomnia just in time to go through the annals and happen to find the reminder that he had not honored Mordecai properly. What a coincidence that Mordecai, by loving his adopted daughter and showing up at the gates to find out gossip about her, happened to overhear a conspiracy that led him to do a good deed that put him in the king's annals in the first place. But the biggest coincidence of all is that the day that Haman decides to kill all the Jews in the month of Nisan, he starts casting lots and spends a year doing it. And then a year later, plus a few days, he says, okay, the edict is going out now on 14 Nisan, the day of the Passover, the day that became Passover. And if we remember the patterns in Exodus, we remember that Pharaoh enslaved the Jews and condemned the firstborn sons. Moses would have died, right? But instead, that pattern was thwarted because Moses lived and rose up, and God killed the Egyptian firstborn on 14 Nisan. Esther is referencing this, surely, right? And Esther is all about how the seemingly unimportant and obedient, compliant woman takes a stand boldly and hatches a plot to undermine her persecutor and successfully sees that through and establishes a new lawgiver in Mordecai. And that's actually really similar to what happens in Exodus 2, because the gap here is that the midwives intervene to prevent the genocide. Oh, these Hebrew women, they give birth faster than we can kill the boys. Mother and sister of Moses intervene to conserve his individual life. The daughter of Pharaoh intervenes, not only to save his life, but to raise him up. Pharaoh didn't see any of that coming, but God provided. And as a result, the expected pattern was reversed, and the persecutors who wanted to kill Israel's firstborn ended up having their own firstborn killed. So most of the drama takes place in this gap, and the reason that Esther disobeys rather than obeys is because in this extreme circumstance, disobeying the letter of the law of the king, don't come into my presence or you put yourself at risk, counted as doing a higher thing, which was keeping the law that preserves the life of people from unjust slaughter. It's a very literary book. What I'll leave you with is that there are other patterns through it, but this is the main one, and that we can take away from it this, that in a story like this that is filled with the specific details and trappings of everyday life, we can discern patterns and we can discern moments where everything hinges on key events that are perhaps not even things that we engineer, but that turn out to be incredibly consequential. And seeing that play out in the safe realm of literature helps us to understand that we can also bring that interpretive sensibility to our everyday lives. Filled with detail as they are, the course of our own stories sometimes hinges on things over which we have no control, but that God is providing for a greater outcome that neither those contriving against us nor we trying to fashion our own lives can foresee. So the ultimate message of Esther, I think, is trust the God of Exodus. Trust God, because he knows how to save his people. And he knows that when you're condemned by law, unjustly, but even if you're justly condemned by his law, that he also knows how to provide salvation. Okay. Close in prayer. Lord, thank you for the beautiful tapestry, the mosaic, the literary weave, not only of the words that you've left for us, but of the lives with which you've endowed us, and with your way of creating and sustaining and redeeming and restoring everything that exists, everything that you have created, everything that you will conserve. And we thank you that we participate in this because you have provided an additional edict, an additional covenant, a new covenant, through which we are saved from the law that condemns us. In Jesus' name, amen.